My name is Chris Miller. I was 34 years old the last time I visited Black Pine Forest. At the time, I worked as a freelance photographer in Seattle. Most of my jobs involved photographing apartments, office interiors, cafes, and small businesses for advertisements. It paid well enough, but after several years of doing the same work, my days had started blending together. Every morning felt the same. I would wake up, make coffee, answer emails, edit photographs, then spend hours staring at a glowing screen inside a quiet apartment. Sometimes entire weeks passed without me noticing much of anything. The city always felt busy, even late at night. Cars outside, people talking through apartment walls, sirens somewhere in the distance, lights glowing through windows until morning. After a while, I started feeling mentally exhausted from all of it. Not scared, not depressed, just tired in a quiet kind of way. I wanted silence, real silence, the kind you only find far away from cities. So one evening, after finishing a long editing project, I booked a small cabin in a forest campground several hours north of Seattle. The photos online looked peaceful. Tall trees, wooden cabins, fog drifting through the mountains. Exactly the kind of place I had been thinking about for months. I planned to stay there for 4 nights. No work, no deadlines, no phone calls unless absolutely necessary. Just quiet days, cold air, coffee, and long walks through the forest. A few days later, I packed my bags before sunrise. I brought warm clothes, hiking boots, a flashlight, my camera equipment, and a few books I never had time to read at home. The weather forecast said there would be light rain most of the week. Honestly, that only made the trip sound better to me. I have always liked the sound of rain, especially at night. There's something comforting about hearing rain outside while lying in a warm bed. The drive north took several hours. At first, traffic was heavy leaving the city. Gray buildings stretched endlessly beside the highway. But little by little, the roads became emptier, the towns became smaller, the trees became taller. Clouds covered most of the sky that afternoon. By the time I reached the mountain roads, a soft rain had already started falling. It wasn't heavy, just a steady, relaxing rain that tapped softly against the windshield. I lowered the radio volume so I could hear it better. The farther I drove, the quieter everything became. Eventually, I reached a narrow forest road surrounded by massive pine trees. Fog drifted slowly between the trunks. The road curved through the mountains for several miles. Every now and then, I passed old wooden signs pointing toward hiking trails. The entire place felt isolated, but peaceful, near sunset. I finally saw the entrance sign for Black Pine Campground. The wooden sign looked old and weathered. Rainwater dripped slowly from the edges. I turned onto the gravel road leading into the campground. The tires crunched softly beneath the car. Tall trees surrounded the road on both sides. I immediately noticed how empty the campground looked. There were only a few cabins scattered through the forest. Most of them sat far apart from each other. Warm yellow porch lights glowed faintly through the rain. The deeper I drove, the more distant the world outside felt. Eventually, I reached a small wooden office near the center of the campground. A dim light glowed through the front window. I parked the car and stepped outside. Cold air immediately wrapped around me. The rain smelled clean, fresh, mixed with wet pine and damp earth. For a moment, I just stood there listening. Rain hitting leaves, water dripping from rooftops, wind moving softly through the trees. No traffic, no voices, no city noise, just forest and silence. I grabbed my bag and walked toward the office. The wooden porch creaked beneath my boots. Inside, the room felt warm and dimly lit. An older man sat behind the desk, reading a paperback novel. He looked up when I entered. "You must be Chris," he said calmly. I nodded and shook his hand. His name was Walter. He looked around, 60 years old, maybe older. Gray beard, thick flannel jacket, calm eyes. He spoke slowly, almost quietly, like someone completely used to silence. Walter handed me a small brass key attached to a wooden tag. Cabin 6. One of the quieter cabins, he explained. Farther from the main trail. I told him that sounded perfect. He smiled faintly, outside. Thunder rumbled softly somewhere far away in the mountains. Walter glanced briefly toward the window, then back at me again. "Not many visitors this week," he said. "I noticed," I answered. He leaned back slightly in his chair. "People usually stop coming this late into the season." I nodded. That made sense. Rain continued tapping softly against the roof of the office. Walter looked thoughtful for a moment before speaking again. "If you go walking after dark, stay near the marked trails." His tone remained casual, but something about the way he said it caught my attention. I asked him if there were bears nearby. He smiled slightly. "A few," he said. "Mostly they avoid people." Then he paused briefly. "The forest just gets strange at night sometimes." I laughed softly. The sentence sounded odd, but Walter didn't laugh with me. He simply looked toward the rain outside. After a few seconds, he stood up and grabbed a flashlight from the counter. "I'll show you the way to the cabin," he said. We stepped back outside together. The rain had become slightly heavier now, not storming, just enough to create a soft, constant sound across the campground. Walter drove ahead slowly in an old parked truck, while I followed behind. The farther we went, the darker the forest became. Cabin 6 sat near the edge of the campground, farther from the other cabins. Trees surrounded almost every side of it. A single porch light glowed warmly beside the front door. Walter stepped out of the truck and helped me carry one of my bags inside. The cabin immediately felt warm and comfortable. Wooden walls, small kitchen, old fireplace, soft yellow lamps, a thick blanket folded neatly across the bed. The room smelled faintly like cedarwood and coffee. Rain tapped softly against the windows. "This heater works fast," Walter said, while pointing toward the corner of the room. I thanked him again for the help. Before leaving, he stopped near the doorway for a second, then glanced toward the dark trees outside. "You hear anything strange out here at night?" "It's usually just animals," he said calmly. The sentence felt oddly specific. I smiled a little awkwardly. Walter nodded once, then stepped back outside into the rain. A few seconds later, his truck disappeared down the dark road between the trees, and suddenly, I was completely alone. I locked the cabin door, unpacked my clothes, and placed my camera bag near the bed. The rain outside sounded even softer now from inside the cabin. Comfortable, almost hypnotic. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat beside the window. Outside, fog drifted slowly through the trees. Water rolled down the glass. The forest looked endless in the darkness. For a while, I simply sat there listening to the quiet. It felt good to finally slow down. No messages, no deadlines, no pressure to be anywhere. Just the cabin, the rain, and the forest around me. Eventually, I changed into warmer clothes and climbed into bed. The mattress was surprisingly soft. The heavy blanket trapped warmth almost immediately. Cool air drifted faintly through the cabin while rain tapped gently outside. I remember thinking it was probably the most relaxed I had felt in years. Within minutes, I fell asleep, somewhere deep in the night. I woke up briefly. At first, I didn't know why. The cabin remained dark and quiet. Rain still fell softly outside. For a few seconds, I simply lay there half asleep. Then I heard it. A faint sound somewhere outside the cabin. Not loud, not aggressive, just strange enough to pull me awake, like something slowly moving through wet leaves. I opened my eyes and listened carefully. The sound came again, very soft, very slow, somewhere beyond the walls of the cabin. I stayed still beneath the blanket, staring into the darkness of the room. Listening, I stayed still beneath the blanket, listening carefully to the sound outside the cabin. For several seconds, everything became quiet again. Only the soft rain remained, tapping gently against the roof, drifting through the trees. The heater hummed quietly somewhere near the corner of the room. Part of me considered ignoring the noise completely and going back to sleep. The bed felt too comfortable to leave. Warm blanket, cold forest air, rain outside. Everything about the cabin felt peaceful. Then the sound returned, a slow crunch somewhere beyond the window, like wet leaves being pressed beneath careful footsteps. My eyes moved toward the dark outline of the curtains. I listened again. Nothing. The silence returned so completely that I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But now I was awake, fully awake. After a few moments, I slowly sat up in bed. The floorboards creaked softly beneath my feet as I stood. The cabin remained dark except for faint gray moonlight slipping through the curtains. I grabbed the flashlight resting beside the bed, cold metal against my hand. For a second, I simply stood there listening to the rain. Then another sound came from outside, closer this time, a soft scrape, like something brushing lightly against wood. That finally pushed me toward the window. I walked slowly across the cabin. Each floorboard groaned quietly beneath my weight. The flashlight trembled slightly in my hand, mostly from tiredness, or at least that's what I told myself. When I reached the window, I hesitated before pulling the curtain aside. Outside, the forest looked black beneath the rain. Tall trees swayed gently in the wind. Fog drifted low across the ground. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just darkness, branches, rain. I moved the flashlight beam slowly across the trees. The light cut through the fog in pale streaks. Tree trunks appeared and disappeared in the darkness. Then the flashlight stopped. Far between the trees, something stood motionless in the forest. I froze immediately. The shape was unnaturally tall, much taller than a normal person. Its body looked extremely thin. long arms hanging stiffly at its sides. The flashlight only revealed part of its outline. The rest remained hidden inside darkness and fog. For a second, my brain tried to turn it into something normal. A tree, a shadow, a trick of the rain. But the longer I stared, the more wrong it felt. Because it stood perfectly upright, too straight, too still. Rain fell around it, but the figure itself barely seemed real. I couldn't see a face, only a dark silhouette between the trees. My heart started beating harder, not from panic exactly, more from confusion. A deep, uncomfortable feeling settled in my chest. The thing didn't move, didn't react to the flashlight. It simply remained there, watching, at least. It felt like it was watching. I swallowed slowly and stepped back from the window. The cabin suddenly felt much smaller than before. For several seconds, I stood there trying to decide what I was even looking at. Maybe another camper, maybe someone standing farther away than I realized. But something about its height bothered me. The proportions looked wrong, too thin, too long. Another quiet crunch came from outside. I looked back toward the window again. The figure remained exactly where it had been, motionless. Rainwater slid down the glass between us. Without really thinking, I moved toward the front door. Part of me wanted a better look. Part of me wanted to prove to myself there was a normal explanation. I unlocked the door slowly. Cold air immediately rushed into the cabin. The rain sounded louder outside. The forest stretched endlessly beyond the weak porch light. I stepped onto the porch carefully. Water dripped from the roof above me. The flashlight beam moved across the trees again. The figure still stood there, tall, silent, unmoving. A strange pressure tightened in my chest. The forest suddenly felt too quiet. Even the wind seemed softer now. I raised the flashlight higher and called out carefully, "Who's there?" My voice sounded smaller than I expected. The words disappeared into the darkness between the trees. Nothing answered. The figure didn't react, didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there beneath the rain. I waited several seconds longer. Still nothing. Finally, the uneasiness became too much. I stepped backward toward the cabin door. The moment I moved, I thought I saw the figure shift slightly between the trees. Not walking, not running, just a subtle movement, like part of the darkness itself had leaned sideways. I quickly stepped back inside and locked the door. The cabin suddenly felt much warmer than before. I pulled the curtains closed immediately. For several seconds, I stood there staring at the fabric covering the window, listening. No footsteps, no scratching, nothing, only rain. Eventually, I returned to bed. The blanket still felt warm and heavy around me, comfortable, safe. But sleep came slower this time. Every small sound outside caught my attention. Wind through branches, water dripping from the roof, the occasional creak of old wood settling inside the cabin. At some point, exhaustion finally pulled me back to sleep. Morning arrived quietly. Pale sunlight filtered softly through the curtains. The storm had mostly passed. Only a light drizzle remained outside. For several seconds, I lay there staring at the ceiling, remembering the figure from the night before. In daylight, the memory already felt less believable. That often happens after strange moments at night. Your brain slowly tries to smooth everything into something reasonable. I eventually climbed out of bed and made coffee. Steam rose slowly from the mug while I stood beside the kitchen window. The forest looked calm again. Fog drifted lazily between the trees. Nothing seemed threatening anymore. I almost laughed at myself. Maybe I really had mistaken a tree for a person. The human mind can create strange things in darkness, especially in unfamiliar places. After breakfast, I grabbed my camera and headed outside. The cold air felt refreshing. Rainwater still clung to the branches above me. Small drops fell from leaves onto my jacket as I walked. The campground remained quiet. I passed 2 empty cabins near the main trail. No other visitors in sight. The deeper I walked into the forest, the more peaceful everything became. Birds moved quietly between branches. Fog rolled through the trees in soft waves. Several times, I stopped to take photographs. The forest looked beautiful after rain. Dark bark, silver fog, wet earth. For a while, I completely forgot about the figure. The daylight made everything feel normal again. Around noon, I returned to the ranger office for supplies and coffee. Walter sat behind the desk, reading again when I entered. He looked up calmly. "How'd you sleep?" he asked. I hesitated slightly before answering. "Mostly fine," I said. Then I paused. "Though I think I saw somebody standing near my cabin last night." Walter's expression barely changed, but I noticed his eyes shift toward me more carefully. "Near cabin 6? He asked quietly. I nodded. Rain tapped softly against the office windows. For a second, Walter remained silent. Then he leaned back slowly in his chair. "People see strange things out there sometimes," he said. The calmness in his voice unsettled me more than the words themselves. "What kind of strange things?" I asked. Walter glanced toward the dark forest outside the window. His face looked thoughtful. "Tough to explain," he answered quietly. "That's not exactly comforting," I said with a nervous laugh. Walter smiled faintly, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Most of the time, it's nothing," he replied. "Most of the time." Something about those words stayed in my head. I finished my coffee and eventually headed back outside. The rain had completely stopped now. Clouds drifted slowly above the trees. The afternoon passed quietly. I spent hours walking trails, taking photographs, and listening to the wind moving through the forest. But every now and then, I caught myself glancing between the trees, looking, expecting. By evening, the sky had turned gray again. Cold air settled deeper into the campground. I returned to cabin 6 just before dark. Inside, the cabin still felt warm and welcoming. I made dinner, turned on one of the small lamps, and wrapped myself in the heavy blanket while sitting near the window. Outside, rain slowly returned, soft, steady, relaxing for a while. I read one of the books I'd brought with me, but eventually, my attention drifted back toward the forest outside. The trees looked darker tonight, thicker somehow, like the darkness between them had deepened. Several times, I thought I noticed movement far beyond the porch light, but each time, it disappeared before I could focus on it. Probably shadows, probably exhaustion. Still, I locked the cabin door earlier than usual that night. Hours later, After climbing into bed, I woke again to a sound outside. This time, much closer, a slow creaking noise, wood shifting softly beneath weight. My eyes opened immediately. Then came another sound. Directly outside the cabin, a soft footstep across the porch. The sound outside the cabin came again, slow, heavy, a wooden creak across the porch. I opened my eyes fully and stared into the darkness of the room. The heater hummed softly nearby. Rain tapped lightly against the roof. Then another step crossed the porch outside. Very slow, very deliberate. Every muscle in my body tightened beneath the blanket. For several seconds, I didn't move at all. I simply listened. The footsteps stopped directly outside the front door. Silence filled the cabin again. The kind of silence that feels unnatural once you notice it. Even the rain seemed quieter now. I slowly sat up in bed. The room felt colder tonight. Or maybe I was just nervous. Another sound came from outside. A faint scrape against the wooden wall beside the porch, like long fingers dragging softly across wet wood. My stomach tightened immediately. I reached for the flashlight beside the bed. The metal felt cold in my hand. For a moment, I considered staying exactly where I was until morning. The blanket still felt warm, safe, comfortable, but the silence outside felt worse somehow, like something was waiting, watching. I finally stood and moved slowly across the cabin. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet. Every sound inside the room suddenly seemed too loud. I stopped near the front window and carefully pulled the curtain aside. At first, I only saw rain and darkness. The porch light cast a weak yellow glow across the wet wood outside. Fog drifted slowly between the trees beyond the cabin. Then the flashlight beam moved slightly to the left, and my chest tightened instantly. The figure stood near the edge of the trees, closer than ever before, tall, thin, completely motionless. Its head nearly reached the lower branches above it. Rain fell around the silhouette while fog moved slowly across its body. The proportions looked wrong. Arms too long, legs too narrow. The shape almost didn't seem human at all. For several seconds, I couldn't breathe properly. I just stared at it. The thing remained perfectly still, like it had been standing there for hours, watching the cabin, watching me. Then suddenly, a loud knock struck the front door. 3 slow knocks. Boom, boom, boom. I jumped backward immediately. The sound echoed through the cabin walls. My pulse hammered in my chest. Every instinct told me not to open that door. The knocking stopped. Silence returned again, but now I could hear something else outside. Breathing, very slow, very faint, near the porch. I backed away from the window. The flashlight shook harder in my hand now. The cabin suddenly felt small, fragile, like thin wood separating me from something I didn't understand. Another slow scrape dragged across the outside wall. Then silence again. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, listening, waiting. Several long minutes passed. Eventually, the sound stopped completely. Only the rain remained, soft and steady outside the cabin. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting in the chair beside the bed, with the flashlight resting across my lap. Every now and then, I thought I heard movement outside again, a branch shifting, leaves crunching softly, but I never looked through the window a second time. Not that night. At some point near dawn, pale gray light slowly began filling the cabin. The rain weakened into a soft drizzle. Birds started calling faintly somewhere in the forest. Morning had finally arrived. I stood slowly and walked toward the window again. The trees outside looked empty, still, quiet. Nothing stood near the cabin anymore. No footprints crossed the porch. No signs that anyone had been there at all. But deep down, I knew I hadn't imagined it. The knocking, the breathing, the silhouette between the trees, that had been real. I made coffee with shaky hands and stood silently near the kitchen counter. Steam rose from the mug while fog drifted through the forest outside. Everything looked peaceful again, almost beautiful, which somehow made the night feel even stranger. Around mid-morning, I decided to take one final walk before leaving the campground. Part of me wanted fresh air. Part of me wanted proof that there was some logical explanation hidden somewhere in the forest. I grabbed my jacket, flashlight, and camera before stepping outside. The air smelled cold and wet after the rain. Water dripped softly from branches overhead. The trail behind Cabin 6 disappeared deeper into the trees than the others. Fog moved slowly between the trunks. The farther I walked, the quieter the forest became. Soon, even the campground sounds disappeared completely behind me. Only my footsteps remained. Soft crunches against wet leaves. Every now and then, I stopped walking and listened. The silence felt heavier out there, dense, almost unnatural. I kept thinking about Walter, about the way he spoke. People see strange things out there sometimes. Most of the time, it's nothing. Most of the time. The phrase repeated quietly in my mind while I walked deeper into the fog. After nearly 20 minutes, I reached a clearing surrounded by massive pine trees. Mist drifted slowly through the open space. Everything looked pale gray beneath the morning sky. And that's when I saw it again, standing motionless between two enormous trees, closer than ever before. The figure looked impossibly tall now, at least 8 feet, maybe taller. Its body remained horribly thin, dark, almost blending into the forest itself. Long arms hung stiffly at its sides. I still couldn't see a face, only shape, only silhouette. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Cold fear slowly spread through my chest. Not sudden panic, something slower, deeper. The feeling that I was standing near something ancient and wrong. The fog drifted gently across the figure's body. Part of it disappeared inside the mist. The thing stood completely silent. No breathing. No footsteps. Nothing. Then, very slowly, its head tilted slightly toward me. Just a small movement, but enough to make every hair on my arms rise instantly. My body reacted before my mind did. I stepped backward slowly. The wet leaves crunched beneath my boots. The figure did not follow. It simply remained there between the trees, watching. I realized then that I didn't want answers anymore. I didn't want to understand what it was. I only wanted to leave. Immediately, I turned around carefully and began walking back toward the trail. At first, I forced myself not to run, but every instinct screamed at me to move faster. The forest suddenly felt enormous around me. too quiet, too empty. Several times, I thought I heard movement somewhere behind the trees. Slow footsteps, branches shifting. But every time I stopped to listen, silence returned. Fog continued drifting through the forest. The farther I walked, the more uncomfortable the air felt, like something unseen followed just beyond my vision. Finally, I saw the outline of Cabin 6 through the trees. Relief hit me immediately. I hurried inside, locked the door, and started throwing my belongings into bags. I didn't care about staying the rest of the trip anymore. I didn't care about photographs, or hiking, or relaxing. I only wanted distance between myself and that forest. Rain began falling lightly again while I packed. Soft drops tapped against the roof and windows. The sound should have felt comforting, but now it only made the cabin feel lonelier. Within 20 minutes, the car was loaded. I took one final look at the cabin before leaving. The porch remained empty. The trees swayed softly in the rain. Everything looked calm again. Too calm. As I drove through the campground, I noticed Walter standing outside the ranger office beneath the porch roof. He watched my car approach slowly. When I rolled down the window, he studied my face for a second. "You leaving early?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "I think I'm done with this place," I answered. Walter looked toward the forest behind the cabins. Rain rolled steadily off the roof beside him. For a moment, he seemed unsurprised, almost like he already understood. Finally, he gave a slow nod. "Probably a good idea," he said softly. Those words stayed with me the entire drive home. Probably a good idea. I left Black Pine Campground that morning and never returned, even now. Years later, I still think about the thing I saw between those trees. The impossible height. The long silhouette standing silently in the fog. Sometimes, late at night, I still remember the sound of those slow footsteps crossing the porch outside the cabin, and the 3 heavy knocks against the door. Boom, boom, boom. But more than anything, I remember the feeling, the certainty deep in my chest when I saw it clearly that final morning, that whatever stood in Black Pine Forest was not something normal, and maybe never had been. My name is Lucas Harper. I was 36 years old when I stayed at the Seabrook Inn. At the time, I worked restoring antique clocks in Portland. Most people probably imagine clock repair as quiet work, and honestly, it usually is. Long afternoons, small tools, soft ticking sounds filling the room. I'd always liked that kind of silence. There was something calming about taking apart old clocks and carefully bringing them back to life. Some of the clocks I worked on were more than 100 years old. Tall grandfather clocks, old pocket watches, tiny brass travel clocks with faded numbers and scratched glass. Every piece felt connected to another time, but over the years, my work also became exhausting in its own way. Deadlines, customers calling constantly, endless repairs stacked across my workshop tables. Eventually, I realized I needed a short break from the city, not a long vacation, just a few quiet days somewhere peaceful, somewhere cold, rainy, and slow. I found the Seabrook Inn online late one night while searching coastal towns near Oregon. The photo showed an old seaside inn sitting near gray cliffs above the ocean. Weathered wooden walls, fog drifting around the building, warm lights glowing through old windows. The place looked untouched by time. Exactly what I wanted. I booked a small room for 4 nights. A week later, I packed a few clothes, some books, and a small repair case containing 2 antique clocks I still planned to work on during the trip. I actually enjoyed repairing clocks while listening to rain. The sound always helped me focus. The drive to Seabrook took most of the afternoon. Clouds covered the coast the entire way. By the time I reached the ocean highway, light rain had already started falling. The sea looked dark beneath the gray sky. Waves crashed softly against the rocks below the cliffs. Fog drifted across parts of the road. Everything already felt quieter than the city. The farther I drove, the emptier the roads became. Small coastal houses appeared every few miles. Fishing boats rested quietly near docks covered in mist. Around sunset, I finally reached the town of Seabrook. The town itself looked sleepy and old. A few dim streetlights glowed through the fog. Most shops already appeared closed for the evening. The rain continued lightly, soft enough to hear against the car windows. I followed a narrow road uphill toward the inn. Tall grass bent gently in the wind beside the cliffs. Then finally, I saw the building. The Seabrook Inn stood near the edge of the coast overlooking the ocean. 3 stories tall, old wooden walls darkened by rain and sea air. Warm yellow lights glowed behind several windows. The entire place looked quiet, almost forgotten. I parked near the entrance and stepped outside. Cold ocean air immediately surrounded me. The rain smelled faintly like salt water. Somewhere below the cliffs, waves rolled slowly against the shore. For a moment, I simply stood there listening. Rain, ocean, wind, silence. The front porch creaked beneath my boots as I walked toward the entrance. Inside, the inn felt warm and dimly lit. Old lamps cast soft yellow light across wooden floors and faded wallpaper. A grandfather clock ticked quietly near the staircase. The entire building smelled faintly like old books, cedar wood, and sea air. An older woman stood behind the front desk, organizing papers. She looked up and smiled politely when I entered. "You must be Mr. Harper," she said softly. I nodded and introduced myself. Her name was Eleanor. She spoke calmly, almost gently, like someone completely used to quiet buildings. While she checked me in, I noticed several antique clocks hanging across the lobby walls. Some ticked normally. Others had stopped completely. "You like clocks?" Eleanor asked, after noticing me staring at them. I smiled. "They're my job," I answered. That seemed to amuse her slightly. She handed me an old brass room key attached to a wooden tag. Room 12. 2nd floor. Oceanside. Perfect. As she explained breakfast hours and other details, thunder rumbled faintly somewhere over the ocean. Rain tapped softly against the tall front windows. The entire inn felt strangely peaceful, like time moved slower inside the building. Before I headed upstairs, Eleanor spoke again. "There's an old room at the end of the 2nd floor hallway," she said quietly. "Room 16. I looked back toward her curiously. "It stays locked, so don't worry if you hear strange noises from that part of the hall at night." I smiled awkwardly. "What kind of strange noises?" I asked. Eleanor hesitated for a second, then gave a small shrug. "Old buildings make old sounds," she answered softly. Something about the way she said it felt rehearsed, like she had explained it before. I thanked her and carried my bags upstairs. The second-floor hallway stretched long and narrow beneath dim wall lamps. Old framed photographs hung along the walls. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath every step. Somewhere deeper in the inn, another clock chimed quietly. I found room 12, near the middle of the hallway. The room itself felt warm and comfortable. A large bed sat beside a window overlooking the ocean. Rain rolled softly down the glass. A small wooden desk stood near the corner with an old reading lamp beside it. The entire room glowed with soft golden light. I unpacked my things slowly, then placed the 2 antique clocks from my repair case onto the desk. Outside, fog drifted across the cliffs beyond the window. The sound of distant waves filled the room softly. For the first time in months, I felt completely relaxed. That night, after drinking tea and reading for a while, I climbed into bed early. The mattress felt soft. The blankets were heavy and warm. Cool ocean air drifted faintly through the room, while rain tapped gently outside. I remember thinking the inn might have been the quietest place I had ever stayed. Sometime after midnight, I woke suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why. The room remained dark and peaceful. Rain still fell lightly outside. Then I heard it, a clock chiming somewhere down the hallway. Slow, deep, old-fashioned. The sound echoed softly through the inn. One chime, then another, then silence again. I stared toward the ceiling, listening carefully. A few seconds later, I heard slow footsteps crossing the hallway outside my room. The footsteps continued slowly across the hallway outside my room. Not fast, not aggressive, just calm. Measured steps against the old wooden floor. Creak. Step. Creak. Step. I remained still beneath the blankets, listening carefully. The sound moved farther down the hallway toward the far end of the inn, toward room 16. Then everything became quiet again. Only the distant sound of rain and ocean waves remained. For several seconds, I considered getting out of bed to look into the hallway, but the room felt too warm and comfortable to leave. The blankets trapped heat perfectly. The soft ticking of the small travel clock on the desk relaxed me again. Eventually, my eyes grew heavy, and I slowly drifted back to sleep. Morning arrived gray and foggy. Pale ocean light filtered softly through the curtains. Rain still covered the windows in thin streaks. I stayed in bed for a while, simply listening to the sea below the cliffs. The inn remained incredibly quiet. No loud voices, no traffic, only distant waves and the occasional soft creak somewhere in the building. Eventually, I climbed out of bed and made coffee using the small machine beside the desk. Steam rose slowly from the cup while I looked out at the ocean. Fog drifted across the water. Everything outside looked cold, calm, and half asleep. After breakfast downstairs, I spent most of the afternoon working on one of the antique clocks I had brought with me. The small brass mechanism rested carefully beneath the desk lamp, while rain tapped softly against the window. I always enjoyed the tiny sounds clocks make while being repaired. Soft clicks, gentle ticking, the movement of delicate gears. Hours passed quietly that way. Occasionally, I heard footsteps somewhere else inside the inn, but the place still felt mostly empty. I only saw one other guest during the entire afternoon, an older man reading beside the fireplace downstairs. Near evening, fog thickened around the cliffs outside. The ocean almost disappeared completely behind gray mist. I eventually stopped working and walked downstairs for dinner. Eleanor stood near the dining room, arranging silverware when I entered. Soft jazz music played quietly from an old radio nearby. The warm lights and rain outside made the inn feel strangely cozy. "You settling in all right?" Eleanor asked. I nodded. "Best sleep I've had in months," I admitted. That made her smile faintly. For a moment, I considered mentioning the footsteps from the night before, but something about the peaceful atmosphere stopped me. Instead, I simply asked how long the inn had been there. Eleanor glanced briefly around the room before answering. "Almost 100 years," she said softly. I looked toward the old clocks hanging on the walls. Some still ticked quietly, others remained frozen at random hours. "There are a lot of clocks here," I commented. Eleanor smiled again. "The previous owner loved them," she said. "A man named Walter Grayson." The name sounded familiar somehow. "He repaired clocks here for years. Lived upstairs near the end of the hall." I immediately thought about room 16. "The locked room?" I asked. Eleanor nodded slowly. Rain tapped softly against the windows behind her. "He passed away many years ago during a storm," she said quietly. "Heart attack. At least that's what they believed." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The inn suddenly felt slightly colder. Not frightening, just heavier somehow. Eleanor eventually returned to arranging silverware. But before she walked away, she paused briefly. "Sometimes old places hold on to routines," she said softly. Then she disappeared into the kitchen. Those words stayed in my head long after dinner. Old places hold on to routines. Later that night, I returned upstairs, carrying a cup of tea. The hallway lamps glowed dimly against the dark wooden walls. Somewhere downstairs, one of the grandfather clocks chimed softly. The sound echoed faintly through the inn. I stopped briefly near the end of the hallway. Room 16 sat beneath a small wall lamp. The door looked old and worn. A thin layer of dust covered the brass handle. The room appeared completely silent, completely abandoned. For several seconds, I simply stared at the door, then quietly returned to my room. Outside, rain had become slightly heavier. The sound blended softly with distant ocean waves. I spent another hour repairing the antique clock on the desk. Tiny brass gears moved carefully beneath my tools. Working on clocks always relaxed me. The precision, the patience, the rhythm of it. Eventually, I climbed into bed. The blankets felt warm against the cold coastal air. Rain drifted steadily across the windows. At some point after midnight, the clock chiming returned, slow, deep, echoing faintly through the hallway. I opened my eyes immediately this time. One chime, two, three, then silence. A few seconds later, the footsteps began again. Slow creaks crossing the hallway outside my room. Step, creak, step, creak. My eyes shifted toward the door. The footsteps sounded clearer tonight, closer. The old wooden hallway carried every sound. I slowly sat up in bed and listened carefully. The footsteps continued toward the far end of the corridor. toward room 16 again, then stopped completely. Silence filled the inn. Even the ocean sounded distant now. After a few moments, curiosity finally pulled me out of bed. The floor felt cold beneath my feet as I stood. I slipped on my jacket and quietly opened my room door. The hallway outside remained dim and empty. Warm yellow lamps cast soft shadows across the walls. The old floorboards creaked faintly beneath the wind outside. For several seconds, I simply stood there listening. Nothing. Then somewhere far down the hallway, a soft metallic sound echoed faintly. Click, click, like small tools gently tapping against each other. My chest tightened slightly. The sound definitely came from the direction of room 16. I walked slowly down the hallway. Every footstep beneath me seemed too loud. The inn remained completely silent otherwise. As I moved closer, the metallic sounds became clearer. Tiny clicks, soft scraping noises, like someone carefully repairing something behind the locked door. I stopped several feet away from room 16. The air near the end of the hallway felt colder somehow. A faint draft moved across the floorboards. Then I noticed something strange. The sound of ticking, very faint, but steady, like several clocks running behind the door at the same time. Tick, tick, tick. The rhythm echoed softly through the hallway. I stared at the old door in silence. Part of me wanted to knock. Another part wanted to immediately return to my room. Then suddenly, one of the clocks inside the room chimed loudly. The sound exploded through the hallway without warning. I jumped slightly. The deep chime echoed through the inn. Then another chime followed, and another. My pulse quickened immediately. The ticking behind the door continued steadily. For one strange moment, I almost convinced myself I could hear someone breathing quietly inside the room. Slow, calm, patient. The hallway lights flickered faintly overhead. A cold feeling slowly moved through my chest. I stepped backward from the door. The metallic clicking stopped instantly. So did the breathing. Now only the ticking remained. Steady, endless. Somewhere far below the cliffs, thunder rumbled softly over the ocean. Fog pressed against the hallway windows. I backed away slowly from room 16. The farther I moved from the door, the lighter the hallway suddenly felt. I returned to my room and locked the door behind me. For several long minutes, I stood there staring at the entrance, listening. No footsteps followed me. No knocking came from the hallway. Only rain, ocean waves, and somewhere faintly in the distance, the slow ticking of unseen clocks. The ticking continued faintly through the walls, long after I returned to bed. Slow, steady, almost hypnotic. I lay beneath the blankets, staring into the darkness of the room, while rain drifted softly outside. The old inn creaked quietly around me. Wood settling, pipes shifting somewhere inside the walls. Every now and then, another faint metallic click echoed from somewhere down the hallway, like tiny tools being placed carefully onto a table. I checked the time beside the bed. 2:17 a.m. For some reason, the number stayed in my head. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me into a shallow sleep. The next morning, I woke later than usual. Gray light filled the room through the fog-covered windows. The ocean outside had almost disappeared completely behind mist. Rain still tapped softly against the glass. For several seconds, I stayed in bed listening to the waves below the cliffs. Everything felt peaceful again, almost normal, but the memory of the hallway and room 16 still lingered quietly in the back of my mind. After getting dressed, I carried one of the antique clocks downstairs, hoping to clear my thoughts with work. The dining room remained nearly empty. Only the older man near the fireplace sat quietly reading again. Eleanor greeted me warmly from behind the counter. "You look tired this morning," she said gently. I smiled faintly. "Maybe I stayed up too late working," I answered. Part of me wanted to mention the sounds again, the ticking, the tools, the chiming behind the locked door, but something told me Eleanor already knew more than she wanted to say. Instead, I simply drank coffee and listened to the rain outside. The warm dining room still felt comforting despite everything. Old jazz music played softly from the radio again. One of the wall clocks ticked steadily above the fireplace. Time moved strangely inside the Seabrook Inn. Slow, heavy, like the building itself refused to fully wake up. Most of that afternoon passed quietly. I repaired clocks upstairs while fog drifted across the windows. The soft sounds of gears and ticking slowly relaxed me again. Several times, I almost convinced myself the previous night had simply been my imagination. Old inns always make strange sounds. Old pipes, old wood, wind through narrow hallways. That explanation felt reasonable enough during daylight. But late that evening, something happened that changed my mind completely. I had just finished adjusting one of the small brass clocks when every ticking sound inside my room suddenly stopped at once. The silence felt immediate, heavy, wrong. I looked up from the desk slowly. The clock in my hands had stopped. The travel clock beside the lamp had stopped too. Even my wristwatch no longer moved. For several seconds, absolute silence filled the room. No ticking, no ocean, no rain, nothing. Then, far down the hallway, a single clock chimed, deep, slow, echoing through the inn. My chest tightened instantly. Another chime followed. Then another. I stood slowly from the desk. The room suddenly felt colder than before. Outside, fog pressed heavily against the windows. The ocean had vanished completely into darkness. Then came the footsteps again. Slow creaks across the hallway floor. Step, creak, step, creak. Closer this time, much closer. The footsteps moved steadily toward my room. My pulse quickened immediately. I stared toward the door while the sound approached. Step, creak, step, then silence. The footsteps had stopped directly outside my room. For several long seconds, nothing happened. I barely breathed. The hallway remained silent beyond the door. Then slowly, very slowly, I heard the faint sound of metal tools lightly touching each other. Click, click, scrape. The sound came from directly outside, like someone calmly arranging tools beside my door. A cold feeling spread through my chest. I stepped backward instinctively. The room suddenly felt much too small. Then, without warning, one of the stopped clocks on my desk began ticking again. Tick, tick, tick. A second later, the others restarted too. The sound filled the room all at once, and immediately after that, The footsteps outside continued moving down the hallway again, slowly disappearing toward room 16. I stood frozen for several seconds before finally grabbing my flashlight and opening the door. The hallway was empty. Dim yellow lamps glowed softly against the walls. Fog drifted faintly against the windows near the staircase. No one stood there. No tools. No footsteps. Nothing. But near the far end of the hallway, a faint light glowed beneath the door of room 16. I stared at it quietly. The room had been dark every other night. Now pale yellow light flickered beneath the door like someone moving inside. And beneath the silence, I could hear it again. Ticking. Dozens of clocks ticking together behind the walls. Slow, steady, endless. Without fully realizing why, I started walking toward the room. The floorboards creaked softly beneath my feet. Every step felt heavier than the last. The hallway air grew colder the closer I moved toward the door. When I finally reached room 16, I stopped completely. The brass handle looked old and worn beneath the dim hallway light. Ticking echoed clearly behind the door now, along with another sound, soft breathing, very calm, very slow. The fog outside thickened against the windows. My hand slowly reached toward the handle, then froze, because I suddenly noticed something on the floor beneath the door. Fresh footprints, wet footprints, like someone had recently walked barefoot across the hallway. The prints led directly into the room. My stomach tightened immediately. The breathing behind the door continued softly. Then, a metallic tool clinked loudly inside the room. I stepped backward instantly, and at that exact moment, the hallway lights flickered. Once, twice, then briefly went dark. For one terrible second, the entire hallway disappeared into blackness, and in that darkness, I heard the door handle slowly turn from the inside. Click. The lights returned immediately afterward. The handle stopped moving, but now, the door stood slightly open, only an inch. Darkness filled the space beyond it. The ticking inside continued steadily. I couldn't move. Cold fear rooted me to the hallway floor. Then slowly, very slowly, a shape moved behind the narrow opening, not fully visible, just a shadow shifting faintly inside the room. Tall, thin, unnaturally still. The breathing inside stopped completely. I stepped backward again. Then another. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. Immediately, without another thought, I turned and hurried back down the hallway. The old floorboards groaned beneath my steps. I entered my room, locked the door, and started packing my bags with shaking hands. Outside, rain hammered softly against the windows. Fog swallowed the cliffs completely. The entire inn suddenly felt wrong. Not violent, not dangerous in a normal way. Just occupied. Like something inside that building had never truly left. Within 20 minutes, everything was packed. I barely slept the rest of the night. I simply sat in the chair beside the window waiting for morning light, and every now and then, far down the hallway, I still heard the slow ticking of unseen clocks. Morning finally arrived, gray and rainy. Fog covered the coastline outside. I carried my bags downstairs as quietly as possible. Eleanor stood behind the front desk, holding a cup of tea. She looked unsurprised to see my luggage. "Leaving early?" she asked softly. I nodded immediately. For a second, she studied my face carefully, then glanced toward the second-floor hallway behind me. The inn remained silent. Only the grandfather clock near the stairs continued ticking steadily. "I suppose you heard him," Eleanor said quietly. A chill moved through my chest. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Eleanor gave a small, sad nod. "He loved those clocks more than anything," she said softly. "Some people never really leave the places they spent their whole lives in." Rain rolled down the tall windows beside the front desk. The ocean beyond the cliffs had vanished entirely into fog. I thanked her quietly, then carried my bags outside. Cold sea air immediately wrapped around me. The rain smelled faintly like salt water and wet wood. As I loaded my car, I glanced once toward the second-floor windows of the inn. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a tall shadow standing motionless behind one of the curtains near the end of the hallway, watching the parking lot silently. Then the curtain shifted, and the shape disappeared. I left Seabrook Inn that morning and never returned. But sometimes, late at night, while repairing clocks alone in my workshop, I still hear it. That slow, deep chiming, echoing faintly in the back of my mind, followed by the sound of calm footsteps crossing an old wooden hallway near the sea.